So welcome back to the Spring 2018 Judge Conference here in the South region of the U.S. With me right now for our first breakout presentation is Alex Toon. Alex is a level 2. He serves the greater Austin area here in Texas. He's been a level 2 for quite some time and kind of guides and mentors most of the judge community down there. So, and he's going to be doing a presentation on triggers. So, give it up for Alex.
Well, thank you for that. Good morning, everybody. Our lunch was great, and it was a long break, so hopefully you're all awake. Today we're going to go over the general rules. This is going to be for newer judges. This is going to probably help solidify your understanding of triggers, and for more experienced judges, hopefully this reminds you of some of the finer points. And something that we often overlook, especially at F&M, where you're just like, oh no, triggers automatically happen. But just to keep you guys involved, I'm not over bribing you. So I have some standard packs that I will be throwing at you for some participation. So hopefully you don't mind sharing. Triggers. All right, the very basics of triggers. I'm sure we all know this, but there's always a trigger signal word, the event, and the effect. Sometimes the trigger isn't laid in the long text of another ability. This is less common now. Older cards have this. Did anyone have any examples of a trigger that's hidden inside of the effect of a spell or ability? Yeah. So especially when they're hidden farther down in card text. Rebound was really tough for a lot of people to understand because it set up this delayed trigger. Sometimes the text of the card was really long, and so the effect people just kind of ignore. The very basics is you're looking for when, whenever, at. So Sao Ren is a really good example of just very, very basic trigger. We got the when, what happens when he enters the battlefield, and then you just lose 3 life. As you can see, I'm choosing highly relevant examples for cards, so I hope you guys appreciate that. So adding triggers to the stack is where people actually get into a lot of trouble, especially players. This is less for me explaining to you how triggers work, and I want you to be able to explain it to newer players. So especially when a lot of abilities are going off, a lot of things die at the same time, a lot of things enter the battlefield at the same time, especially if you know or you yourself play EDH, a lot of goofy things happen. You really need to know how to add a bunch of things to the stack. So anything that gets added to the stack when you're casting a spell is the same thing that's going to happen when triggers are going on the stack. So I need a volunteer for this one. Is anyone level 1 volunteer for this one? All right. I need you to tell me how you would add, in order, all of these triggers to the stack. Just start with the first one. Can you see? You can come up if you. So the first one we have Orzhov Pontiff, one of my favorite cards. So Orzhov Pontiff has entered the battlefield. What does a player need to do when they're adding Orzhov Pontiff's trigger to the stack?
Well, choose the initial resolution, ability they want to resolve once the trigger happens. So they have either the +1/+1 until end of turn, or they don't. The creature your opponent controls gets -1.
Yeah, that is absolutely a modal trigger. So because it's a modal trigger, when you're adding a trigger to the stack, you have to choose the modes. Okay, what about for Hellkite?
So it enters the battlefield, and you choose your targets, and then you choose your targets. As you're choosing the targets, you choose how much damage each target gets. Correct? Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what about for Fabricate?
Oh, Fabricate. So it goes on the stack, and upon the resolution is when you choose, correct?
That is correct. Now, why? This is something that even experienced judges have had a problem with. Fabricate is not a modal trigger. And so we had been used to modal spells, modal triggers before, but they always say choose. And so Fabricate was kind of the example that some people recently had some trouble with, and I saw a lot of judges, even at F&M, telling players that they had to announce what their intentions were as the ability went on the stack. It's not correct, but that's still what they did. Thank you. Timing. Okay, so from the comprehensive rules, because they aren't cast or activated, trigger abilities can trigger even when it isn't legal to cast spells and activate abilities. Events that prevent abilities from being activated don't affect them. triggers they can trigger at odd times. They can trigger in the untap step where we can't do anything. They can trigger during the resolution of spells or other abilities, sometimes very, very odd times. So they still just kind of sit there and wait until someone would get priority, and then we add them all to the stack. So again, another one of my favorite cards is Eureka. So when I spell, are you guys familiar with Eureka? You ever play Vintage Cube? So we take turns putting some interesting things into play, and if you are playing Eureka wrong, and those are the cards you're putting into play, if you put Stoneforge in first, that equipment that trigger triggers. It's there, it's waiting, but it doesn't go onto the stack until Eureka is completely finished resolving. So you put in Glory Seeker and all these other bad cards, that trigger still has to wait till all of those things are done. So triggered abilities can trigger even when it isn't legal to cast spells and activate abilities. Well, back in the good old days of Legacy, we had Counterbalance and Sensei's Top. And savvy players would try to outgame each other with things like Crossing Grip. Now, Crossing Grip has an interesting keyword on there that we don't see very often, is Split Second. So Split Second says as long as this spell is on the stack, players can't play spells or activate abilities that aren't mana abilities. So if you were a Miracles player in the know, you would leave a 3 on top and you'd be able to counter this thing. So it still triggers. This was actually a really big problem for Legacy tournaments where people would get very, very upset. So Chromatic Star, if for modern players, is also one that gets some people. So if you activate Chromatic Star's mana ability when casting a spell, the trigger goes off, but it doesn't get added to the stack until much later. This happens all the time when people are playing Tron and they draw cards before they think it's Chromatic Sphere, which is definitely not the case. And here we have Chromatic Sphere. So there's one sole exception to timing, triggered mana abilities. They don't use the stack and resolve immediately after triggering. If you are a fan of entertaining people who ask nearly impossible judge questions, Chromatic Sphere comes up quite a bit because you're drawing a card or you're doing strange things during the resolution of spells or while you're casting spells. So Mana Flare is another older card that is another triggered mana ability. These things just immediately go off. Now fortunately we don't have too many of them. You see them mainly as just mana abilities that add additional mana without doing any other instructions, but it's really important to know when something's a triggered mana ability. This is one that, again, if you like EDH players and if you listen to their questions, this one came up quite a bit. So if you're not familiar, Selvala has a mana ability where each player reveals the top card of their library, and then you add mana. So it was bad. What players did for a long time is they would constantly activate Selvala over and over, knowing they couldn't possibly cast the spells, try to force everyone to draw their whole deck. The official ruling for these has been that if you try to cast a spell and you've activated mana abilities and the mana abilities have put a card in your hand, we rewind back to the point where the spell was put on the stack, but anything that the cards stay where they are, but this mana ability stays activated. So it does not untap. We do not rewind through that. The same thing with Chromatic Sphere. You crack Chromatic Sphere during the casting of a spell, finds out that you can't actually cast that spell, we rewind back, but the mana that you've activated for Chromatic Sphere and the card stays in your hand. All right, this is one I'm going to need another volunteer for. Zone change triggers are probably the most common ones that people have problems with. Who wants to volunteer? Level 1 judge. Come on up. So this is actually a very common example of something that happens quite a bit in Standard. So we've got Wrath of God, kills everything. We've got a generic creature, but we've got Blood Artist. Now Blood Artist says when Blood Artist or another creature dies, target player loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So that is a zone change trigger.
Yep.
Do you know where that trigger triggers from?
Depending on if Blood Artist ends up in the yard or on the battlefield, either the battlefield or the yard.
So when Blood Artist dies,
Yes.
does that when Blood Artist leaves the battlefield, does it trigger from the battlefield or does it trigger from the graveyard?
So there will be no instance when it is not in either the field or the yard. It's going to trigger in the yard, but it's not triggering from the yard. So it's not, oh man, what's the one that removes abilities of
Yixla Jailer?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yixla Jailer. It's not Yixla Jailer.
So the way that this zone change trigger works is, so it triggers from leaving the battlefield, but the trigger is going to check to see where it ends up. So it
Yes.
makes sure that it goes into the yard.
Yeah.
So if you have something like Rest in Peace in play that sets up a replacement effect that would just exile that card instead, the trigger goes off, but can't see where it goes, and so the trigger doesn't resolve. Okay, so what happens when Wrath of God happens and we see Glory Seeker and Blood Artist die?
Blood Artist looks for creatures that went to the or looks for creatures that have moved from the battlefield to the graveyard. Sees 2, activates twice.
Yes.
Or triggers twice.
And that is because this is like the highly technical version of Leave the Battlefield triggers. Leave the Battlefield triggers are triggers that look back in time. And that is really, really important because there's a lot of very weird corner cases that come up. But when Blood Artist hits the graveyard, that trigger goes back to look at what happened beforehand, and it sees both of those creatures die. So that's absolutely correct. But I've got another question for you, but this is yours anyway. But what about cards like Blood Chief Ascension and the highly relevant Ice Cauldron, which is one of my favorite Magic cards? So Ice Cauldron's not important, but read Blood Chief Ascension.
So Blood Chief Ascension says at the beginning of each end step, if an opponent lost 2 or more life this turn, you may put a quest counter on it, and then if a card's put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, if it's got 3 or more quest counters, they lose 2 life, or you may have them lose 2 life. If they do, you gain 2 life.
So I'm blowing up the world with Planar Cleansing.
Sure. So presuming Blood Chief Ascension, do we know how many counters are on it?
It's both 7, all the counters. It's got all the counters on it.
Okay, great. So Blood Chief Ascension is going to see all opponents' permanents go to the yard.
So is this a Leave the Battlefield? This is a zone change trigger, but
it is a zone change trigger.
Is this a Leave the Battlefield trigger? Look at it very carefully.
Blood Chief Ascension doesn't care about it leaving the battlefield.
Okay, so when I blow up both of these cards simultaneously, will Blood Chief Ascension trigger?
It should. It's still looking back at time.
It will not. So there's a key phrase up there. Says from anywhere. And from anywhere is a garbage phrase that was included, but we don't control any of that. That when you see from anywhere on a trigger, those triggers are not counted. They're zone change triggers, but they're not Leave the Battlefield triggers. So when both of these cards get blown up simultaneously, that trigger will not look back in time and will not see anything else die with Blood Chief Ascension.
So it's specifically looking for a thing is in the graveyard from any other zone.
So from anywhere is a special phrase, and actually it's common. We see it on Emrakul the Aeon's Torn is one of those cards, and we'll have an example that comes up with there. But it's common, and you see judges just get this wrong constantly. It's very corner casey, but it's something that it's really important in like the modern and legacy formats because they come up often enough. But I appreciate you hearing me, and here you are. Thank you very much. You hand him the mic. So again, you're looking for this phrase from anywhere, and it's not as common as far as Leave the Battlefield triggers go, but it happens enough that it's important for you guys to know. In that instance, no triggers? It will not trigger. So because they get blown up simultaneously, that trigger does not go back and look to see if anything else, and because it doesn't see the opponent's Ice Cauldron go into the graveyard, there is no trigger at all. Now, Turn to Frog is an interesting card, and anything that wipes abilities from creatures is something worth noting. Does anyone want to take a crack and see how these cards would interact? Anybody? You get magic packs. Anyone new? Give it a shot. Well, this is a good learning opportunity. Yeah.
Here's our level 0.
So here's the mic. So you familiar with Turn to Frog?
Yes.
Okay.
I've had it played against me.
Okay. So Turn to Frog says until end of turn, target creature loses all abilities and becomes a blue frog with base power and toughness 1/1. So if I cast Turn to Frog on your Blood Artist, and then your Blood Artist dies, what happens?
He just dies.
Mm-hmm.
Because he loses all abilities.
He loses that ability because when Blood Artist dies, it's just not there. Now, there's a card over there called Dread. You may not be familiar with Dread, but read it pretty carefully and using our past examples to see if we can figure out what happens with Dread. So I've cast Turn to Frog on Dread.
Okay, so it would lose the ability of fear,
It would lose it, yep.
so it's just a 1/1.
Mm-hmm.
So I would think it'd just be a 1/1. It wouldn't trigger.
So because that second ability, like it's again it's the same thing. Is because it's referenced, it says from anywhere. That trigger, even though it didn't have it when it was on the battlefield, when
So
that
it's still dread.
it's still dread, blue frog, base power, toughness 1/1. It has no abilities, but when that
but it
card
did go
hits the
graveyard.
graveyard, that ability isn't looking back to see that it has no. It's not there. So when dread has lignify or humility or any of these other things that remove abilities from it, when that hits the graveyard, it doesn't matter. It still gets shuffled back in.
Okay.
So again, that clause from anywhere is something that we just don't take a look at because it's not on a lot of judge tests and it's not on a lot of cards, but it's it's something that's important to the way that the game works. All right. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, take one of these.
Yes, I had to turn the frog lead on me.
Ben, you want to? Oh, mute. All right. So very similar example. Humility is another thing that just removes all abilities from creatures. I actually like playing Humility and Legacy against things like Emrakul. But this is actually where it comes up, and we actually had issues at a Star City where a judge didn't believe me, and we had to actually talk to multiple people and look up from this from anywhere clause. So Emrakul doesn't care. It hits the yard, and it didn't matter that it didn't have abilities before. Because it specifically says from anywhere, it will shuffle back in. So if you tear the Emrakul, you do something else when it has no abilities, it's still going to get shuffled in. Any questions on any of this? Mm-hmm.
So in this case, with Emrakul and Dread, if the from anywhere clause is removed, would it not get shuffled?
So if there was something like Yixla Jailer that removed the abilities from graveyards, then it would stay. Because then it didn't have the ability in the zone that it mattered. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but it's like if Emrakul just said when Emrakul was put in the graveyard, its owner shuffles to the graveyard.
It would not be shuffled. Yeah, because that would be a true leave the battlefield zone change trigger instead of a just zone change trigger with the from anywhere clause. All right, intervening ifs. Everyone familiar with intervening ifs and all the fun that they bring? All right, triggered ability may read when, whenever, at, and then the if. When the trigger event occurs, what needs to happen is the condition must be true for it to trigger anyway, and must be true when the trigger goes to resolve. If it's not true in both places, it doesn't happen. Now this is important for cards like Valakut or Chance Encounter that have very clear intervening ifs. And if you plan on judging or playing any Modern, you really need to know how cards like Valakut work, especially because everyone has questions on how Ghost Quarter and Tech Edge interact with these cards. Everyone familiar with anyone not familiar with Valakut or how the intervening if works? So the card itself says you must have 5 other mountains in play when a mountain enters the battlefield. And so what a savvy Modern player will do is they will destroy the first mountain to trigger. And then the trigger will resolve for that mountain, and then the other ones will only see 4 other mountains in play, and so none of them else will resolve. Does anyone have any questions on intervening if triggers? There's actually been quite a few of them to come up in Standard recently. No one has any questions on them? State triggers. We don't see straight triggers very often anymore. Some triggered abilities trigger when a game state, such as a player controlling no permanence of a particular type, is true rather than the triggering when an event occurs. Dark Depths is a very common stage trigger. Emperor Crocodile is another one. These cards do not work the way that people who have stifles want them to work, and it actually comes up where people do stifle these triggers and then get very upset. So understanding and being able to explain to these players that it is a state trigger is really important. Just saying, nope, it doesn't work is probably fine during the ruling, but finding these players after the fact and explaining to them why their thing doesn't work is a great way to, one, help them in a customer service manner, and just kind of explain to them, and it makes them a little less angry. So Dark Depth says when it has no ice counters on it, sacrifice it. If you do, put in Giant 2020. So even if you stifle that ability, as long as Dark Depths' condition is true and its own trigger is not on the stack, it will just continue to trigger. It doesn't constantly trigger because it would just continue to trigger forever, but it also waits to make sure that its own trigger is not on the stack. Make sense? Optional triggers. Now, one thing that you'll hear newer players, or sometimes even experienced players talk, especially at regular REL, is triggers just not optional. This trigger was mandatory. Well, that's not exactly words that we use. Optional triggers have may in them, and then so it says these abilities go on the stack when they trigger, regardless of whether a controller intends to exercise the ability option or not. You make the choice to use it when the ability goes to resolve, but you still have to do everything that you have to with a normal trigger. So if there's targets, you have to choose targets. If there's modes, you have to choose modes, divide damage, or do any of the other things that has to happen. So in standard for a short period of time, people use Phantasmal Image to copy creatures. And when you played a card like Restoration Angel, the angel would, even if you had no intention of ever blinking Phantasmal Image because you'd have to sacrifice it, you still had to. So this was something that bothered a lot of players. There is not an option just to not have these triggers. And then for these examples, we always assume that no one's trying to cheat, but you have to add these triggers to the stack if the rules require it. Frenzied Goblin. Who wants to take a crack at Frenzied Goblin? All right, Jason.
So when it attacks, you choose the target creature.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then how many times can you activate it?
So when Frenzied Goblins attacks, you choose the target creature,
Mm-hmm.
and then when it goes to resolve, you choose if you're paying red or not.
Mm-hmm.
It's only when it attacks, so it only can trigger one time when it turns sideways.
Okay. A lot of players, anytime this card is in standard, I think it was in standard not too long ago, it's in standard now?
It's not to be new.
Oh, it's in Dominaria? Or I think there's something similar, but not exactly.
Frenzied Goblin was in standard not too long ago, and a lot of people just said, oh, I'll attack and I'll just pay red, I'll pay red, I'll pay red, I'll pay red, I'll pay red. And the problem is that it just doesn't work that way. So again, this is not only just to brush up on your knowledge of triggers. This one is fairly simple, but we need to be able to explain to people that have these kind of triggered abilities, like what happens. Yes?
On that one, though, you don't have to choose a target unless you pay the red, though, right? You don't declare a target when it attacks.
No, anytime you add a trigger to the stack that has the word target in there, it must be chosen when it goes on the stack.
Okay.
So that's the same with modes or with anything else. Anytime it says target creature in a trigger, a spell, the same thing with a spell, even if it's an optional ability, you still have to choose when it goes on the stack.
Even though it's worded the opposite? It's when it attacks, you pay red, and then if you do the red, then you declare a target?
Yeah, because it's all part of the same trigger. Mm-hmm. Delayed triggers. So delayed triggers come up quite a bit. They're in a lot of keywords for sets, and they're a lot of the times they're referencing creatures. But these are the ones that are going to have a lot of problems with people not keeping track of delayed triggers. So their unusual type of trigger ability is a delayed trigger. Delayed triggered abilities are created by spells and abilities and some replacement effects. They are unique in a way that they wait around for a bit and then trigger at the appropriate time. So common examples: sneak attack, very, very highly played card. Rebound we don't see very often, but it was important because I want you to see that sometimes these triggers are set up by keywords on spells, and it's important to keep track of these. And then there are some delayed triggers that use certain wording that allow them to trigger multiple times, and Hunter's Insight is one of them. Okay, so a delayed trigger ability will trigger only once the next time the trigger event occurs, unless it has a stated duration such as this turn. So if I've cast Hunter's Insight on my fencing ace and it deals combat damage, let's say both times, how many cards am I drawing? I'm hearing some ones. Why one? Yes? And then? Yeah. So the this turn clause allows these types of delayed triggers to go off as many times as the condition is met. I mean, you can get really ridiculous. So we can have Fencing Ace, and we can have Aurelia the War Leader, and we can have all sorts of things. It can trigger over and over and over and over again. But you have to see this turn. Now, some delayed triggers do not have this, but they look like they would trigger over and over again. So it's important to know that when we're looking for these small things that we just kind of glossed over when we were studying to be judges or we're looking through the rules, you need to be looking for things like this. So, who wants to volunteer for this one? Come on up. So we've got Sneak Attack and Perforos, God of the Forge. Now, we're not going to go too deep into what the board state looks like, but you have a Sneak Attack in play, and you cast Sneak Attack and you put Perforos, God of the Forge in. You attack with it because your devotion is appropriate, but your opponent does something to reduce your devotion to lower than what it's necessary to make Perforos a creature. What happens to the delayed creature of Sneak Attack? Or the delayed trigger of Sneak Attack?
The delayed trigger is still on the stack, so it would resolve at the end.
But Perforos isn't a creature. Does it still get sacrificed?
Yes, because it's still the same card that got that on it.
Exactly. So the delayed trigger doesn't care about the characteristics of the card. So Magic cards are kind of worded awkwardly. I don't want to say poorly, but it's not too far off. That trigger does not care what that permanent looked like. If you had an artifact that somehow you turned into something that had a delayed trigger that cared if it was an artifact or something else and its type changes, it doesn't matter. That permanent still goes away. We got one more for you. So yes, the delayed trigger ability that reverts to a particular object still affects it even though if the object changes characteristics. Everybody's favorite, thank you very much. Detrimental triggers. I don't want to get too far into competitive REL and the missed trigger policy. We'll touch a little bit on the end, and that is a subject that I think you need to have maybe a full hour to go over. But these are some very common detrimental triggers, and these are actually fairly obvious, right? When Ornery Kudu enters the battlefield, put a -1/-1 counter on target creature you control. That's not good. You don't want that. I mean, you can maybe build a deck around it, but you typically do not want that. At the beginning of your next upkeep, pay that amount of mana or you lose the game. Again, no one wants something like this. But the detrimental triggers aren't always as clean cut. Sometimes triggers are positive sometimes and detrimental at other times. Or sometimes like a trigger looks it looks detrimental, but it's the reason that someone put it in the deck. So actually figuring out which triggers are beneficial and which are detrimental is something that's really important. So some triggers do two things, one good and the other bad. Others do something that may be beneficial in some cases but detrimental in others. In cases like these, it's not always obvious whether a trigger should be considered generally detrimental or not. These are two really, really common examples that you should be very familiar with. So the first test that we're given is called the vanilla test. So would you play the card if it didn't have the triggered ability in question? Would you expect the card to cost more or less without the ability? So Dark Confidant, I think Dark Confidant's maybe $80, something like that right now. If it was a 2/1 for 1 and a black, would you pay $80 for it? Would it be a 4 of in Modern Jund? No. So that trigger is generally not considered detrimental. Of course, there's times where it's detrimental, where you're facing down a flurry of lightning bolts and you don't want to die, but we don't look at that. We just say that card, that is definitely beneficial. Goblin Guide, another example that if we took away that trigger, a 2/2 haste for 1 is actually pretty good. And there are times where that trigger actually does things that the controller likes. Being able to see what your opponent's drawing every turn is a good thing. But based on this vanilla test, we know that both of those are detrimental triggers. So in competitive REL, we would be giving warnings for these things. Anyone have any questions on these? Or how about any other detrimental triggers that are actually fairly common in the modern or legacy format? No? No detrimental triggers? Back triggers, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. So when in doubt, especially in newer sets, there is a list that is published every set release that goes over what triggers are considered generally detrimental and which ones aren't. Do not try to memorize them. Just reference the list. Of course, using the first test and this next test will help you, but some of them are kind of odd. This one included. So take a look at Nyx Weaver. At the beginning of your upkeep, put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard. This trigger is considered generally detrimental. Though if that trigger was not on that card, no one would have ever played that card. That card actually saw a little bit of play. So the second test is called the Ignore Intent Principle. So when considering whether a triggered ability is generally considered detrimental or not, do not consider what the intentions of the game or deck designers were in making the ability, including the card in the deck. Only look what it does to the game state and whether or not it gets you closer to winning or losing. Well, slowly milling yourself out gets you closer to losing, so this trigger is actually considered generally detrimental. There are a lot of triggers like this. So in limited tournaments, especially like the one coming up at Dallas is a limited tournament, right? So there's going to be a lot of very subtle detrimental triggers that if you're judging or playing in that event, you need to be aware of. All right, the oddities. I don't know if any of you, well, if you were judging during Theros Limited, a Crowan horse was a real fan favorite because it was one of the few times where you could give your opponent a detrimental trigger. And there were entire matches won just on opponents forgetting to give their opponent, giving their opponent who gave them the horse a soldier token. Really odd. They come up very rarely. But it's something to be aware of. You're going to have to be able to explain to players. Anytime anyone plays that card, you're going to have to explain what it does. The same goes with Tabernacle. Tabernacle is even more weird because it has a default action. And fortunately, they're $2,000 now, so not a lot of people are playing them. But you still need to know if you plan on doing side events or legacy GPs. Mm-hmm. Yeah, knowing what these do is really important, and knowing how to handle them. With Tabernacle, if you play Tabernacle, does someone actually want to explain how these ones would work? Yeah, come on up. We'll do a two-parter. So I play Tabernacle, and you have a bunch of little elves. Mm-hmm. Okay, at the beginning of your upkeep, you do nothing, and then you draw a card. Now what happens?
They are all destroyed.
Mm-hmm. Now why is that?
Because it's not the Tabernacle controller's triggered ability to remember. It's the opponent's, because it's an ability given to each of the creatures.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not because of the way the Tabernacle is so oddly worded. The controller of the trigger is not the person who owns or controls Tabernacle. It's the person who owns the creature in question. And so, what would be the results? All the creatures are dead. Mm-hmm. Would you get a warning?
No, it's the default action.
Is it a detrimental trigger?
Oh, if they failed to sacrifice.
It's at competitive REL. If this is a competitive REL, would you get a warning for missing your Tabernacle trigger and all your creatures dying?
I think so.
Anyone else? Is this a detrimental trigger? Yeah.
For having them all die?
Uh-huh. Okay. You miss a trigger. There's a default action which allows us to clean everything up really nicely, and all your little elves are dead. But it is a detrimental trigger that you did miss, and so you would get a warning for it. It's a real feel-bad moment that no one likes unless you're playing the Tabernacle. Thank you very much. Howling Mine. Howling Mine's an example that comes up quite a bit, and there's not a lot of Howling Mine play, but Dictate of that one. Dictate of Krufix is seeing a lot of play. If you like turbo turns, and I mean, who doesn't, then you see these type of effects all the time. This is a trigger that can be both beneficial and considered generally detrimental. And so this type of trigger is important. There's a lot of cards that do it. There's a Kami, there's other things. So at regular REL, it's not so bad, but at competitive REL, if people have been missing Howling Mine triggers, this is one that warnings come out for. This is a trigger that if you control Howling Mine and you are not reminding your opponent, you are missing that trigger and you do get warnings for. So these things do come up quite a bit, and a lot of judges just say, oh yeah, Howling Mine, drawing cards, that's good. No warnings come out to it, and that's just not accurate. So especially with a mistake that can happen over and over and over again, it's really important to make sure that you know when these ones are beneficial and when they are detrimental. Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely, yeah. Because, I mean, everyone likes drawing cards on their turn, especially if it's your ability that did it. But if you're trying to prevent your opponent to draw cards, you're either cheating or missing a trigger, and you need to get a warning for it. So miss triggers at regular. I'm not going to read the jar to you, but it's there. A couple things that we'll go, and then I want to make sure that we focus on, and you guys should make sure that you're brushing up on the jar. They do change it they've changed it twice since I've been a judge, so make sure that you're caught up on it. But these are the two sections that are really important. These abilities are considered missed if the player did not acknowledge the ability in any way to the point where it required choices or had a visible in-game effect. Who wants to explain to me and all of us what they mean by required choices or visible in-game effect? Give me some examples. Yeah, JD? Well, hold on. You gotta get mic'd up.
Okay. So visible in-game effects. That's like things like adding counters to things or creating tokens.
What about getting something +1/+1?
Getting something +1/+1 is not a visible game effect until it would be dealing damage.
Okay.
So as long as you acknowledge it when it would have an effect on the life totals, that's what matters.
So what is the most obvious visible in-game effect that actually players seem to forget? The life total change. That's a big one.
Yes.
Where they don't announce things like that, or they cross it off on their life pad and they don't announce it to their opponent. That's actually one that if you're watching a large Magic tournament, the thing that you should probably do when you're walking around is like looking at life total pads. It's probably the easiest way to see, like, stop a game and prevent a really big issue, because no one likes to say, I lightning bolt you and you're dead. It's like, I'm actually at 4, and then we have to go all the way back through the match. So just walking around and making sure that that's there, because a lot of people miss those visible in-game effects. Yeah, so you're absolutely right, but what about required choices?
Required choices. Those are triggers that require you to actively make some decision, and those have to be acknowledged by actually vocally making that decision.
Yeah, sure. Like, can you give me some examples?
Off the top of my head, no.
Targets is a good one. So,
yeah.
if a trigger requires you to choose a target.
Yeah.
Modes are another one. Dividing damage is another really common one that happens. So those ones are really important. This second, thank you by the way. Yeah, you're good. They're not near mint, but they're good. If the ability includes the word may, assume the player chose not to perform it. This is another one where I think too often we are either not paying attention or too nice at like F&M. If someone walks up and they're like, oh, Judge, I missed my trigger, a lot of times we have this reflex to be like, oh, how long ago was it? Real close? Yeah, it happens. Not technically. Now, what's really important here is we have the ability to kind of influence how the game happens, like how the game should have happened. Especially if a player's new, you can try to explain to the opponent that the trigger should have gone on the stack. But the default, especially at things like win-a-boxes or where there's actually some real prize, game days or another, is like the default is they chose not to perform it. That's something that I know that I have definitely kind of glossed over. I don't know if any of you have just said, oh, the trigger is missed, you get it anyway because it's within a reasonable amount of time. But this is something that, that I've definitely forgotten. So the last few minutes, I guess we'll open it up to questions. If anyone has any questions about missed triggers, we can go over a little bit of competitive RAL. I know the policies changed not too long ago with some things like Goblin Rabble Master and some of the other types of triggers. But anyone have any questions or comments about triggers in general? Yes. Yeah, it's real fun. Yeah, people don't like that one. So, is everyone familiar with the Scarab God? The Scarab God. What is the exact wording of the Scarab God? The hand. Whenever it dies. So that is a delayed zone change trigger, and those types of triggers we do not have the option to miss. Now, as an opponent who sees you, if you see your opponent miss those things and it gets brought up, you get some power to decide when it comes in, whether immediately or at the beginning of the next phase. So it's just important to know how to solve those things. Now, this is something that's typically for competitive RAL, but I imagine it's going to come up quite a bit unless he gets banned in the next standard. So I don't see that happening, but not for like a year. Yeah. Yeah, he's going to be around a long time. Obsidat was one of the ones that had a lot of trouble. There was some very famous disqualifications and bannings that happened when people would forget to bring back their Obsidat, cast Supreme Verdict, and then remember to bring back Obsidat. So there was some problems there. Mm-hmm.
I was going to bring up that point. You always have to remember that if you believe that a player is intentionally missing a trigger.
Mm-hmm.
Remembering later, like they're intentionally missing a beneficial trigger to because they're going to do something that would make it beneficial later for them. That's cheating, investigate that, definitely lose your.
Yeah, absolutely.
A comment with that, with missing triggers, it is important to note that it is never your responsibility to remember your opponent's triggers, and you can intentionally miss those.
Yes. What it's important about that, and one thing that there was a slide that I took it out. I do not like the way that the judge program talks about that. They use the term 100%. You are 100% responsible for your own triggers, and your opponent doesn't have to do anything. That is not technically true. You, as an opponent, have to make sure that your opponent is resolving the triggers correctly. Now, this happens with triggers that do multiple things: Sword and Feast and Famine, Huntmaster of the Fells. If you see that your opponent puts a 2, like everyone familiar with Huntmaster, remember what that card does? If your opponent puts in a 2/2 wolf but does not register that life total, you are cheating. That is cheating. You cannot just say, oh, nope, they forgot their trigger. It's like, nope, they remembered their trigger, but they did it incorrectly. And so it is important to know that, yes, while you can have them miss their trigger and you're not responsible for them to remember it, you are still responsible for it to resolve correctly. And we had another question?
Okay, so I actually have 2 questions. For the first one, in the Howling Mine example, so if my opponent plays a Howling Mine, and I miss my trigger, I don't draw the extra card, and then it goes back to him. And
it's always their trigger. It is always their trigger to remember.
So if he doesn't remind me and I forget and I only draw 1 card, and it goes back to his turn and he remembers and draws 2 cards, and I call a judge, would we both get warnings, or how
no? Your opponent would get a warning for mistrigger.
Okay.
It's not. You don't get a warning for your opponent's miss trigger. Only they get one. So they would get the warning, and because it's within like a correct amount, like a reasonable amount of time, then you'll get the card. As long as it's not too far off, then you'd get that.
Okay.
One.
And my second question is, I know with triggers that are may, if it's missed, they're assumed to not have taken
Chosen
action.
not to have taken it. Yeah.
Is that the same for a resolution of a spell as like Path to Exile? If they forget to like fetch a land, are they?
So that actually got changed pretty recently. You have to, if there is something that is optional for your opponent, remind them that they have that option. So that is something that got like just a few months ago.
So then, if I forget to remind them and they don't fetch,
then you can get in trouble.
Do they still get to fetch though?
Oh yeah, I mean yeah. If it's it's within a reasonable amount of time. Now, it can be scummy if your opponent hasn't, and if you don't notice it within a reasonable amount of time, it's a feel-bad moment because they didn't remind you. But remember, at all times, as an opponent or as a player of Magic, you are responsible for the general, correct play. So it's unfortunate in that situation, but it's still, they do get the warning, but it's still your responsibility to make sure things are going correctly.
Thank you.
Anyone else? All right, well, thank you for paying attention and staying awake post-lunch. I appreciate it. And, yeah, thanks.